Hello, welcome to Thursdays on the Stoop. Today we have Writing the Wounded Character, How Feelings, Emotion, and Fear Function in Plot with Emily John Tobias. Emily John Tobias is an American author and poet with her debut story collection, Monarch, forthcoming by Black Lawrence Press in May 2024. That's now. She is an award-winning writer whose work has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, along with other honorable mentions, and has been featured in various literary journals and magazines. Midwestern raised, she now lives and writes on the coast of Southern California, where she is at work on her debut novel and other projects. She holds a Master of Fine Arts in Writing from Pacific University, Oregon. Thank you so much for being here. Emily, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so happy to be here with all of you. And thank you so much for joining me. This is a rich topic, and I hope that what we discuss resonates with you in your heart and that you can take it forward with you in your writing journey. So thank you all so much for coming. Yes, we are going to talk about writing the wounded character, how feelings, emotions, and fear function in plot. Um, I, I want to say that this is one inroad. There are many, many inroads, but this is a process that I use and have made into my own process when writing my work. So this is just one way of many, and I am here to, and I should say too, please, if you have questions, jot them down as we go. I'm going to leave, at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. And so I'm going to get started into this incredible topic that I'm so passionate about, and talk to you for about 30 minutes on the topic before I read to you from my upcoming book. All right, so let's get one thing straight. Every story is about change. If there is no risk or no change, there is no story. In this, the status quo must be destabilized in some way. So this begs the question, what changes? Often people think of the narrative or plot changing the character. This is not so. The character is what changes. So, for example, let's just say that two characters are walking down the road and they have the same view of, each have their own views of the same landscape. This brings into question point of view, which I'm also incredibly passionate about and will be a talk for a later time. But let's say same landscape, two different characters walking down the road. Let's say that one of them is very hungry and the other one's very tired. The one who feels hungry will most certainly notice that diner off in the distance. This feeling of hunger, this urge toward the diner, will dictate what this character decides to do. The one who feels tired, of course, notices that awesome motel in the background, where the one who feels hungry misses the motel altogether. This, again, this feeling, this urge of hunger versus tiredness will dictate different sequence of events based on decision making for each character. So these feelings, these urges, these are the driving factors within the character that propel them to make choices. Those choices create change within the character that then affect the narrative. These changes can work internally. They can also work externally. But the really, really key fundamental thing here to remember going forward in your writing journey is that change must happen for a story to exist. let's go through a little bit about character roles, because character roles are determined by one thing and one thing alone. This is the capacity for a character to change. This is what determines if you are dealing with an antagonist versus a protagonist. So I will go through a sort of, this very generalized, quick explanation, but it's really important to remember that what differentiates a protagonist from an antagonist is not how little or much they appear on stage. It's not how important we think they are. It's not how intense they are. It is their capacity for change. So here we have protagonist. This is the character in the story that has the greatest capacity for change. The protagonist must either restore balance to their world or change their world altogether. The narrative arc deals with how a character changes. Then you have your antagonist, which is a secondary character indeed, that has their own journey of change. They must change, but a smaller journey and less capacity for change. What happens is these two characters then, in the smaller journey of change, the antagonist overlaps with the protagonist. And this is where you have that dynamic between them. The catalyst character is that character that drives the protagonist and antagonist together. They act as the catalyst for conflict. And we need conflict. We need conflict in writing, whether it be internal or external. And the nature of change, whether it be internal or external, is some sort of conflict, oftentimes within. Let's see what's next. Okay. All right. I am going to, in order to exemplify how this process works in a short period of time, this process of writing the wounded character, I'm going to show you all the first 2 minutes of this short silent film on YouTube. I am going to purposefully cut the video short because I'd like to ask you, going forward after the video, we're going to use these characters as examples. Imagine that you will be tasked with writing the end of this narrative, or how the story proceeds after. So we will not see the end. I'll try and drop the link for you later so you can see how it ends later. But for our purposes, we'll just watch the first 2 minutes with the task in mind of writing the story's end. To prepare for this process, please just jot down the following. Who is the protagonist? Who is the antagonist? Who is the catalyst? And really, most importantly, for our purposes, list as many feelings as you can gather that these characters are experiencing. Let's
Life is good. It is good to me. And it was meant for you. Live and be free. Live and be free. Walk the path. Take some time to laugh. Maybe it's been a while, but even try to smile. Even try to smile. 'Cause today is only here and tomorrow. So more living the life and full of regret and sorrow. Lift your head up high and open your eyes. You can choose to be happy. If you try, you might be surprised. Choices that you make can be revised. No fear for the time you're here. And if you don't know where to start, then follow your heart. Follow your heart.
Okay, are you all with me? Alrighty, with these characters in mind, protagonist, antagonist, catalyst, let's really get into this here. Mostly we will be dealing with the protagonist. So whoever you decided that is, keep that character on your heart while we talk about this and in your mind. Okay, so what do I mean by a wounded character? A wounded character carries fear. An emotional wound is the fear that the protagonist carries, or the antagonist actually as well. This fear drives the narrative action because it determines what decisions your character will make. Think of the wound as a form unto itself. It is active. It is alive. Sometimes it's bleeding. Other times it's healing. The wound is a form unto itself that lives within the character. In fiction writing, a character must confront its deepest wound in order for conflict to occur and change to happen. So as the writer of The Wounded, with these beloved characters of ours, we must be constantly putting pressure on that wound. That's the key. Within the wound, there are two states. One is the emotion. The emotion is the heart or the root of the wound. This emotion is static, often unchanging, but it underlies all decisions a character makes. And as we go through this, it's, I'm so passionate about talking to you all about this because this is a perfect time in the world to talk about this. So please don't be afraid to consider yourself in this process, right? Like, it is my very heartfelt sentiment that we need our work right now. We need each other and we need our work. And our work can teach us and show us more about ourselves through our characters. So sometimes we're taught to sort of detach from the work, right? I'm going to ask you to suspend that and go in. Take yourself into the process. Take yourself into your work, and think of yourself, how you've been wounded and how you've healed while we talk about this. Okay, just for now. So the root is often static and unchanging. Emotions can be highly irrational because of fear. This is key. Because of its static nature, the emotion itself has no story of its own. It underpins decisions a character makes, but it does not hold the weight of a story on itself. So examples of emotions are fears of abandonment, betrayal, feeling unworthy, loss, rejection, shame. These are examples of root emotion. They do not hold a story on their own. So for example, we are not writing a story about abandonment. That's not how this works. Moving on to feelings. So the difference here. A feeling is a state of being driven by the emotion or the root. Feelings are symptomatic of the wound. They can be fleeting, they can move, they can shift, they can be irrational. These are often stories we tell ourselves to rationalize the emotion. Feelings can become a neurosis, they can become an obsession. This is good storytelling, story writing, right? So unlike the root of an emotional wound, stories can and will be built around feelings because of how they shift. Examples of fleeting states of feelings are sadness, anger, resentment, jealousy, self-consciousness, guilty, happy, nervous, anxious, gleeful. These are all states of being. And they change and they shift, and we create stories around. Okay, so let's use the little YouTube that I showed you to sort of think about this in a, more structured way so we can actually use this information, right? So how will the story proceed for your protagonist? In my view, the protagonist is the man on the train. He has the greatest capacity for change in this short story. She also has a capacity for change. Smaller. They cross paths. So we will ask our characters, and I really want to stress this because this gets like may feel a little goofy, but we have to consider these characters beings. We need to communicate with them. And so a lot of my work depends on asking my characters questions, having a relationship with these characters, right? So we would ask him, dear silent protagonist, what are you most afraid of? The answer he gave me, just me, and he could give you all a million different answers, which is the beauty of this, is I am afraid of abandonment. So let's talk about the emotion behind this. Dear silent protagonist, why? Why are you afraid of abandonment? Well, I was rejected. I've been rejected. I was betrayed in my past. Then I would say to this character that I'm visualizing, tell me more about that. This gets into backstory, memories. These are all important parts of understanding the emotion for this particular character. Again, here we have, the story will not be about abandonment or the fear of rejection. The story is about this character and all of these feelings that create change in the character along. The feelings, I would ask this protagonist, what feelings do your fears and wounds create in you? And so now just think of the video, right? Embarrassed, shy, enamored, jealous, anxious, desperate, a little needy, insecure, nervous, all of that we saw in 2 minutes of a video without ever hearing them speak. How do you show these feelings in your body? Well, gesture, right? Gesture and body language, which we will get to. So this is sort of an example of how I would investigate these characters that come to me right from the get. Moving on. I could talk about this whole day with you beautiful people. All right, so let's talk a little bit about risks and stakes and how to interrogate your own work. Writing the wounded character is a co-collaborative effort between the writer and the character. The character makes choices based on their particular sets of wounds and fears, and depending on what they are willing to risk to protect those wounds. Risks and stakes must be there. They must be present. Understanding them is a complex process, right? The writer, us writers, we imagine infinite routes toward the central conflict, which is the wound, based on characters' wounds. And then we cross-check this with narrative logic, which we'll talk a little bit about next, before deciding which route the character takes. So this is a constant co-collaborative process of communication with these characters. So let's say the wound of abandonment was present in this character on the train. We would ask this character, or we would ask ourselves, if your protagonist is deeply afraid of abandonment, how high would the stakes be in pursuing new love? High, right? Very high. In fact, maybe the highest. How high would the stakes be for losing love? Very high. And here's where we get into really good, good story writing, fiction writing, because we are constantly wanting to raise the stakes for the protagonist. What would the protagonist risk to pursue love? Would they shut down or would they cling? In the video, it's unclear, right? If they gain love, what would they risk to keep it? How far would they go? So the really important piece of this, when you think about this later, is the stakes and risks are relative to the level of woundedness. The less wounded, the less at risk, and the lower the stakes. So for example, for a character wounded by betrayal and abandonment, new love will be riskier because more is at stake for them. What would this character risk? Betrayal is a big wound. Think of if any of you, and I certainly have been betrayed, we know what that carries with it and what kind of fear that instills, right? But let's say a character wounded by, say, a stranger offending them in the street would risk less likely to act out revenge on them. What characters risk and what is at stake will be relative to the impact and size of the emotional wound. So for a character that has never been betrayed, does not fear abandonment, asking this woman out on the train is probably not such a big deal, right? So this is a good place for me to suggest a challenge. And I would say to you, isn't it true that all characters, all human beings, have some fear in one way or another? In this way, all characters are slightly wounded. The question is, how wounded are they? And is this enough to raise stakes to create a story out of? But the good news is that this process of untangling character psychology really can apply to any project you're working on. Woundedness will always raise the stakes, which makes for good writing. Let's talk a little bit about narrative logic, and the best question in the book for us writers is why? So there are two types of narrative logic. One we're not so concerned with here. It is logical narrative logic. It deals with time and space sequencing. Emotional narrative logic is really what we're dealing with here. And this is the idea of, does this decision make sense given the sets of wounds and fears the character holds? This acts as a check and balance for the logic behind your character's decisions. It's sort of like walking up a staircase backwards. The story is arranged to drag the character toward the central conflict. Because this is a co-collaborative process, there are so many roads as we've discussed, but the reader must be able to buy it. Even if it's riding on the edge of shock and surprise, which we love, right? Urgency, suspense, shock and surprise, and transgression, there has to be points of logic in place. The question of why will get you to the heart of all of that. So in order to write wounded characters, you need to understand how are they wounded. In order to understand this, you must open lines of communication with your character. We are unwinding character psychology. You must ask them questions. You have to listen, which can take time. Okay? And you have to ask yourself questions. We ask ourselves and our characters questions to get to the root of the wound, the key emotion. Once we have that, all of the narrative gets formed from it, because this will impact all the decisions the character makes. So, for example, if you were betrayed badly, we would ask ourselves, are you sure you would make this decision in this particular way? This is a delicate building of a relationship with these characters that we create. So for example, dear silent protagonist on the train, why are you waiting so long to talk to this woman you see every day? What fears are holding you back? How long will you wait? And most importantly, why? Why? And then we ask ourselves, dear writer of the wounded, does this character's need to hold himself back work as relative to his wound? Let's say he has wounds of abandonment. Does this need, how he holds himself back from her, work as relative? Yes. Yeah, it certainly does, right? How wounded must he be to hold back to such a degree? And this is really wonderful too, because if you're stuck, you can also work backwards through this process. So if, let's say you're doing some generative writing and you're having visions involving a character that has this neurotic feeling about something or a neurotic gesture, you can ask that character, what emotion underlies that? Why are you incessantly biting your nails? Why can't you make eye contact? Right? These types of questions. And then we ask, so we continue to ask why. So really, why is the only tool that you need to get to the heart of the matter, the heart of the character. And from there, with narrative logic, checks and balances, we can create these really engaging, rich, deep works. I love gesture and body language. It's one of my favorite tools in all of what I've learned about writing. It is a gesture and body language are concrete methods through the madness. There are no tricks here. So I hope this, this little bit can really help you. So we all have heard this thing, show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. And you know, and it's true. And so let's think about the protagonist on the train. I list gesture and body language as the best tool in your belt as the writer of the wounded. So how do we know what this character feels without hearing him speak? How do we know how she feels? And we do, right? And we know how these characters feel in 2 minutes with no dialogue. We know this because of where their gaze goes, right? We see that they have sort of a shaking knee or a trembling hand, or is he steady? Where's the smile? Is it tight-lipped or wide? Everything shows on the body, especially for wounded characters. So gesture and body language, roots in emotion, these ethereal, sort of windy spaces, into the physical world and on stage. Roots, thoughts, and feelings in the physical world and on stage and in scene. So gesture and body language bring feelings to the physical plane to show rather than tell your reader what your character feels. In this way, we never ever have to say he was sad. We can, we do not have to. So a really great tip, very, very simple, basic, actionable tip is that every time you write an emotion, whether clearly stating or subdued in subtext, anchor this with a gesture. And I mean in line, in the line, in prose. Every emotion written can and should be anchored in a gesture and written on the body. And when I read to you in a few minutes, yes, hopefully you'll hear some of that in my work. Okay. So this is so wonderful because this all is plot. Right? This character psychology, unwinding, asking characters questions, this all falls under the umbrella of plot. So let's think about the video. I suggest that the protagonist is the man on the train because he has the greatest capacity space for change. We've determined character roles. I suggest that she would be the antagonist and the man that sits there for a few moments and he becomes a little jealous. He is a catalyst character. He creates conflict between them. The protagonist's emotional wound, I suggest, could deal with abandonment, perhaps because he has been betrayed in the past. If I am tasked with writing the end of the story, as you guys are imagining for yourselves, I will stick with that. That will be my check and balance. He is wounded by abandonment because of a betrayal in the past. What are the feelings associated with this, right? We talked about feelings. So this causes, in my imagination, this causes a massive fear of rejection in the man. And because of this fear, he is insecure, nervous, anxious, jealous, overly excited at some points. He's fixing his hair in the mirror. He wants everything perfect. These are states of being that drive his decisions. How does he show this on his body and in his body language? I like this video because there's so much body language here. It's how she looks for him, he looks for her, the way his gaze goes, how he holds his shoulders rounded. All of these things work toward that. We determine risks and stakes. There is a high risk for him to pursue to pursue love with this woman, given his wound of abandonment. And we've put checks and balances in place via emotional narrative logic through interrogation and asking questions ongoing when we write the end of the story. Why? And we've already talked characters' decisions based on wounds and fears drive the narrative. This is plot. And you get to decide how this plays out. As long as co-collaboration is in place between you and your character, as long as you're asking why with checks and balances in narrative logic, so the reader might be shocked and surprised, but they will buy it. They will accept this because of what they know about the wounded nature of the character. All right. So that was a lot, and I hope that some of it hit home and resonated with all of you. I think next what I'll do is I'm going to read a short excerpt from my story. I have, oh, and I forgot this part. Let's go through this really quickly. This is an idea for you to get started writing a wounded character. Where you would use the starter silent film I shared with you, intend to write the end, visualize the protagonist or the antagonist, and ask the character a series of questions to investigate this wound. Free write, 30 minutes. Don't pick up the pen. Don't cross stuff out. What are you most afraid of? Why are you afraid? How are you feeling right now? And do you have anything else to share with me? And then use this information and go back and rewrite the beginning. And I think maybe what I'll do is I'll leave this up while I'm reading to you guys, and so you can jot that down. Let's see. Okay, so my book is coming out next Friday, and I'm quite excited about that, of course. I am going to read you a short excerpt that's looking like just about 10 minutes or so from the opening story in the collection. This centers around Liza, who is one of my favorite protagonists that I got to know through the process of writing the collection. She is deeply wounded by shame, and I hope that this reading perhaps illuminates some of this wonderfully rich discussion that I had with you today. So let me go back and put the free write info here so you can jot that down while I'm reading. This is from Red Cardboard Hearts Hanging from String. He'd been clear with you early on that having a family was never part of his game plan. You'd assumed he'd changed his mind when he married you in a King County courthouse that stormy Thursday in February. You wore a black dress, forgetting about the holiday altogether. No bouquet, no corsage, not even a rose tucked behind your ear. Why? Because I'm allergic, Liza. Fuck, how many times do I have to say it? He was angry with you on the drive to the courthouse. Half drunk, you only realized it because of how hard he gripped the wheel when you touched his arm. He said nothing. You lit a cigarette. He locked your window, leaving you to ash in your hand. Can you put this out, please? You asked. He looked straight ahead, mouth turned down. Baby, please, you begged, mouth forced up at the corners. You handed over the burning filter. He rolled down your window and flicked the butt out your side. You leaned back just in time, watching the thing get taken by the wind and rain. He took a long, deep breath before securing your side of the car. You sat together waiting behind the bar in the gallery of the courtroom while an older couple finished their ceremony. The woman wore a long flowered dress. She was taller than her man with bright feathers in her hair. She reminded you of a peacock. She held a young girl's hand while the judge read the vows. You heard them kiss from where you waited. The woman was weepy but gleaming, and she kept touching the side of the man's face with a tissue while tears rolled down hers. They were smiling, especially the daughter, and all three huddled at the end. The girl walked out between the couple, each hand in one of theirs. When the door closed behind them, the air thickened as if in a vault. Your left leg began to tremble. 2 weeks before, you'd lost the baby. The pregnancy was no shock, given that you'd stopped taking your birth control pills after a conversation with your mother that ended something like, "When are you going to grow up, Liza?" "Maybe never, mother." "What else, Liza? What else?" "What else is there, mother?" Then one Thursday night, he held up a small baggie, swaying it back and forth. After the first line, he ran his hand along your back. You sucked salt off the backs of each other's hands and clinked wine glasses of cheap tequila together until one shattered, leaving you holding just the jagged stem as if in ritual. Liquor ran down your hand, your wrist, your arm, like you standing there too high on one last sundown of Hanukkah in your childhood home, the only teenage marking left on your body, a hot pink stripe against dark curly hair. You'd rushed home late from the 8-bit arcade, barely making it on time, your mother already in position at the dining room table. She loomed like a vintage portrait on the wall in the murky light from that ancient stained glass chandelier. Baruch atah Adonai, you sang and lit the match. Eloheinu melech haolam. The candle shifted. You reached to catch the menorah from falling, your sleeve inching up. When your mother saw the small crane tattooed on your inner wrist, she kept her eyes down and said, disgrace. That was all she said. Then she left you standing there with wax dripping down your hand. Later that night, he grabbed the bottle and flipped the lights off in the house. Then he led you outside to the front porch, where you sat on the stairs in the dark, slightly apart from one another, but angled in, knees touching. Your clouded head streaked the skyline into a million thrashing comets. He pointed to the giant Ferris wheel, said he'd propose up there, up top. I'll throw a penny in the sound for good luck. No shit, you'll say yes before the thing hits water, he said. You laughed and kissed him, tugging on the back of his hair. He pulled his face away and said, if you're lucky, maybe I'll even put a baby in you by winter. You downed shots after each empty promise as if in sport. By the end of the bottle, you were puddled on the porch, fused into one another. It had been decided. Yes, he'd stay with you forever. Yes, he'd prove it. Yes, he better. Yes, you would. Then you went back inside to his bed, more rigid than before. When a bright sun broke like a yolk behind Pier 66, you two were still wide awake, then hiding your eyes from one another. Somehow you knew there was a little girl in you. You checked the clock on the courthouse wall. The second hand ticked. A court reporter dressed in pink filed her nails. She batted eyelashes at the oversized bailiff as he ducked under red cardboard hearts hanging from strings. Your phone rang. Your mother. Shit, now you hadn't told her yet about the marriage. Not after the last check. You declined the call quickly, stuffed the phone into your pocket, and there it was. There she was, Helena. You ached for her even years later, as if somehow she'd arranged the whole courthouse thing, decorations and all. How odd that you'd remembered to bring it, like you needed to take her with you over the threshold with him. That note she'd passed to you from under her desk in the 5th grade while Miss Furlong's back was to the class. Then in the courthouse, you suddenly smelled her everywhere, the girl you finally put your clumsy mouth against in 7th grade, folded on top of each other behind the wooden slats of the bedroom closet after school one. Light showered Helena's earlobe, her shoulder, her bare chest where a gold Star of David hung. You breathed into her ear as if fogging up a window. Like this, you asked? I think so. Yes, she said. That's good. Neither of you knew your way. You fumbled with the button of her jeans and slid your wet palm under her shirt, and you thought you might be loved when her pulse beat into your palm against her back. Smiling in the dark, you swore there was just one of you. He nudged you with his elbow. What's wrong with you, Liza? Jesus, pay attention. We're up. The whole marriage ceremony was already late getting started. Vows were forced, read like the end of some commercial for a prescription drug. When the judge announced you man and wife, there you stood, reaching back into your pocket while secretly wishing he'd eventually cave and want to raise some kids. He never did. Okay. Thank you for listening. So I think what I'll do now is open this up for questions. If you have any, I think we have about 10 minutes. So if anybody has a question, I'm happy to answer.
Hi, Emily. This was really helpful. I wanted to think about how a wound might be in tension with desire and how that impacts motivation and choices. And even stakes too, right? So like especially with growth.
Yes. So I love that question, Hillary. Thank you. Desire, I would suggest, is a state of being. It's a fleeting state of being. It's more a feeling symptomatic of a wound. So desire is a wonderful energy to drive narrative. So the question is, so if you have a character in mind that is constantly in a state of desire, right? You would want to ask that question, why? What's the desire? Why do you desire? Because underneath, so we've accepted the fact that desire is a state of being. So we know that under that state of being is some root. So the key, and this is really, this is a very, this whole talk actually, this process is very deep, and it can feel quite overwhelming because there are a lot of options, but it's quite formulaic. Right. So the key then is you've located the feeling, the state of being, which is amazing. And it's so wonderful because desire is it's so generative, and it's fun to write. So the key then is to ask, what is the key root emotion underneath that set of desire? Once you find that, and when you guys start talking to your characters, it's like a breakthrough. Right? Like you get to know these characters and you'll go through, no, that's not right. That's not right. And then suddenly you'll say, yep, got it. And for me, in my process as a writer, I have to write endless pages of dribble to do this. I mean, endless pages until finally I usually have 2 stories that come out of that. And within that process, I will get to the heart, but it takes a lot of generative writing for me. That's my process. And so, yeah, so keep asking questions, Hillary, and find that root fear. And then we got it. Yeah. Thank you. So how are you? Nobody else has a question. Maybe I'll ask you. How are you all feeling about this? Does somebody want to share how you feel hearing about this process, and maybe something that could relate to what you're working on these days? Well, while you're thinking about that, I'm going to try and drop a couple of links in the chat. First of all, if any of this is interesting to you folks, I'm teaching an 8-week fiction writing workshop where we'll meet every Saturday starting in July. And it's called, what do we call it? A healing fiction workshop. So we're going to actually be using, and all of this process that I've been talking to you about, we're going to be really investigating this, using this, looking at works of other writers, and generating new work in this quite traditional style workshop. But it will deal with all of these concepts that we've talked about here. So if you are interested in this and you want more of this, I'm going to This is through Chill Subs and Write or Die magazine. I'm going to try and drop this link into the chat. I think that did it. I will also drop my website in there. And one last, I am going to give you guys the YouTube link. If you want to watch the end of it, you might be surprised. But I would suggest before you do that, try the writing exercise. Yeah, so in fact, definitely don't watch the end until you try the writing exercise. There. Does anybody else want to share anything, or even if it's not a question, just if anybody else wants to share how they're feeling or what they're working on, or anything at all before we close?
Oh, I don't have a question. I just wanted to point out that there's a question in the chat.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for saying that. I don't know the question. Can you give an example of an anchor emotion? Is that the question? So when we talked about anchoring, that was actually dealing with gesture and body language. So I think when I talked about emotion, I discussed a root emotion, which you can really think of as like the root fear. The key with emotion, while we're talking about it in this context, is think of the emotion, the root fear, as a form unto itself that lives within it. So I'll give you an example. I'll use me. My dad left when I was really little. And so in my life, I always, no matter how much healing and growth and work on myself and all the things, I always have a little wound, a pocket of a fear of abandonment. I carry that with me. And it dictates some of my choices and decisions. These days, I'm done a lot of work to heal, so it's not bleeding as much as it used to. So that's an example of the root emotion, but I think you might be expressing the question about gesture and body language. So gesture and body language allows us to anchor emotion on stage in scene, right? So it's a physical manifestation of a feeling, mostly feelings. So gesture and body language are physical manifestations, they are feelings and thoughts in form. I hope that explains the or helps answer the question. Well, I think we just have a couple minutes. I'd just like to take a moment to thank you so much for being here with me, to allow me to, traverse this very rich territory with you all. And I really hope that you are having fun writing, that you will continue to write and create wounded characters or less wounded. And I'm just really happy to have you all as part of my community. So please do reach out to me. I would happily engage and do more of this in the future with all of you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. I'm about to share some links in the chat. Those links are other upcoming events from Blue Stoop, including next week's Thursday session, which is Why, How, and Where to Write About Craft and the Writing Life with Andrea Afer. There's also a survey, so you can tell Emily what a great job she did. There's also a link to donate. If you like what Blue Stoop does, you want to help keep these sessions running, we really appreciate the support. So thank you again to Emily, to everyone who participated today. This is a great session. We're grateful for your time. Enjoy the rest of your
Thank you.